Hello and welcome. I'm Ellen Horstman with First United Methodist Church of Camden, Arkansas, coming to you this Sunday with our very last lesson for our Sunday school class from the Passion Play, Living the Story of Christ's Last Days by Rob Fuquay. And so he calls this very last chapter The Power of the Cross. As he puts it, the cross is where the tradition of putting on the Passion Play in Oberammergau began so many years ago in 1633. During that plague in 1633, in which, let's see, I think it was 84 out of 600 villagers, in other words, 14% of the people had died. The villagers were suffering terribly, and in their suffering they came together at the church and prayed before the crucifix. And it was there that they decided that they would make a vow to put on a play that showed the passion or the suffering of Jesus. As Fuquay puts it, in their suffering, the villagers turned to the suffering of Jesus and found help. The message that they have broadcast for nearly 400 years is there is hope in the cross of Christ. But let's think about the cross for a minute. Of course, we've become used to seeing it, but what a symbol. This was not initially the symbol that Christianity used, and Fuquay says it was probably not until the 4th century that it became widely adopted as a Christian symbol. There's some hints it may have been used a time or two before then, but not till the 4th century. The cross, after all, in the time of Jesus, was a means of the most vile execution. It was a punishment that was given for the most heinous crimes, or given to traitors or people that were insurrectionists. So it was not something nice at all. As a matter of fact, it involved terrible humiliation. First of all, I mean, you're going to be publicly put to death in front of people who are going to assume that you are a terrible criminal or you are a rebel. But more than that, you're going to be, if you're the criminal, you're going to be stripped to either down to your loincloth, which would be the equivalent of our underwear, or more often, you might be stripped completely naked, and then you're going to be nailed to this cross, and you're going to know that as you're dying and after your death, that you're going to be out there for everybody to go by and see as a symbol and a threat from Rome. So it's pretty humiliating. And of course, the suffering is grotesque. For one thing, the Romans didn't just put you on a cross. First, they flogged you, a flogging that was so severe that a lot of times that's what killed somebody. But if you survived that, then you had to carry the very heavy crossbeam that was going to be nailed to the upright beam. So you had to carry that to your place of crucifixion. Then you would be nailed to it, but they couldn't just put nails in your hands. They had to tie ropes around your hands because the weight of the body hanging from the cross would have ripped the nails right out of the flesh. And then you're going to die a very slow death by asphyxiation, because basically as the weight of that body is hanging there, the person can't breathe. But we supply you with a little push off, and so you can take your legs and push up as much as you're able to try to draw in a breath, and that goes on for agonizing hours until the person simply cannot push himself up anymore, or until the Romans get tired of waiting and break his legs. So it's grotesque, it's humiliating. What on earth would make that a symbol? As Fuquay says, a religion that used a cross to identify itself would have been confusing and horrifying to people. And yet, by the 4th century, this cross had become a Christian symbol. Now, maybe it was because the Emperor Constantine was said to have, he's the first Roman emperor that would become a Christian, and he's said to have had a vision of a cross as he was going into a major battle to consolidate power, he saw an image of a cross in the sky that said, conquer in this. And so he thought, so the cross became a big deal to him. But ironically, that cross that had been a symbol of shame was now a symbol of victory and triumph. At least it was for Constantine. As Fuquay says, can you think of ways today that people use the cross as sort of a good luck charm? For Constantine, it became a symbol of power. He had it put on shields, and he was going to conquer in the name of the cross. And so, as Fuquay says, is it possible that nowadays people use a cross as a kind of a good luck charm? Or can you think of modern examples where people bring an expectation that their Christian faith should provide them with victorious living while sparing them from suffering? Yeah, we can probably think of times like that. To me, the cross has, for many of us, become a very pretty piece of jewelry. And I like wearing crosses. But sometimes we just like to wear them as a pretty piece of jewelry, or sometimes we like to display the cross in much the same way that people like to display a flag. Sometimes people will display a flag to show their patriotism, and sometimes people will display a cross so they can sort of broadcast to the world, look at me, I'm a good Christian. But since we're talking about the cross and what the cross, this one-time emblem of so much humiliation and terrible suffering, what it means, let's take a look at something that happens in the Gospel of Matthew. Now, of course, you all are familiar perhaps in Matthew 16 as in Mark chapter 8. Jesus asked the disciples, who do people say that I am? And of course, Peter will end up saying, you are the Messiah. Well, shortly after that, in Matthew's Gospel, he says, I'm reading from chapter 16, beginning with verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he meant to go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed on the third day, but on the third day be raised. So, I'm sorry, he's going to be killed and on the third day raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, now God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan, you're a stumbling block. You are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone wants to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it again. Oh my. I mean, we've heard that story before, and we like that. Get behind me, Satan. But think about Peter in this moment. He wasn't on this side of the cross like we are. So the very idea that a Messiah would go to a cross was insane. He's just confessed that Jesus is the Messiah. And like most Jews, he would have been expecting that Messiah to be making a power play pretty soon. He would have expected that Messiah was going to be a glorious king. He was going to have all this power, and life was going to be great with the Messiah. The last thing that he would have expected was humiliation and suffering, a cross, much less to be told by this same Messiah, oh, by the way, it's not just a cross for me. If you want to be my follower, you have to take up a cross yourself. Peter must have been shocked. No wonder he rebukes Jesus at that point. And let's take a look at the cross and the symbolism that is inherent in the cross. To begin with, as we said earlier, the cross meant humiliation, horrible humiliation. Now, probably Jesus didn't expect us to have the same type of experience. He doesn't mean that we literally have to take up a cross, but he may mean that we have to be willing to suffer some humiliation. I'm going to let Pastor Rob Fuquay tell us about what he thinks here. I'm looking on page 108 of his book. When Jesus told his disciples to carry a cross, He wasn't saying that we should literally be crucified. He was saying that following him means being willing to be misunderstood, wrongly judged, and derided. In short, carrying a cross involves enduring humiliating places. Such a place might result from taking a stand, or from lowering ourselves to do humbling chores in order to show love to others. Maybe such a place will come from the honest admission of sins that we have committed. Some people look at humility as weakness, but facing humiliation always requires courage. So here's what he's saying. Humiliation might result if we take a stand that people don't understand, or if we lower ourselves to do humbling chores for other people, or maybe even in an honest admission of sins. And I'm going to say something about that honest admission. I don't think that Fuquay just means off by myself praying an honest admission of sin. Sometimes it means being willing to be weak and vulnerable among others in a small study group or even at church to admit to sins, to being a sinner. Or it might be something as simple as being willing to go to the front of the church to pray. In our church for, the last couple of months or so, the pastor has placed a time when people can come up to the front and pray. And she told our small study group she was hoping, among other things, that people coming to the front to pray would be a good model for our children so they can see that this is what Christians do. Christians pray. But of course, what we have found sometimes is there's a lot of waiting. The piano player is playing the piano or she's playing the organ, and people can come up, but there's hesitation. So since I'm the lay leader of the church, I have felt sometimes like, well, I need to go up there. And I've had to struggle with that. It's not that I don't pray. I do pray. It's not that I mind that people know that I'm praying. It's just, it feels a little odd. And I got to thinking about it, and I know why. It's because when someone goes up to pray, we think, well, I wonder what's bothering her. I wonder what the problem is. And so I've had to try to learn to humble myself to go up there and pray, because you don't have to have something wrong with you to pray. So I think, well, I can just go pray for the concerns that we've raised at church. And what I have learned is if I'm willing to get out of that seat and go up there, sometimes that makes it easier for other people. And sometimes there is a person with something that's deeply bothering them. But sometimes it's just a joy or whatever, but we go to the front and pray. I guess that's not much of a cross, but hey, it's one. The willingness to humble ourselves. Well, what else can we say about the cross? The cross involves sacrifice. It was a huge sacrifice on the part of Jesus. And that reminds me that we sometimes like to use that expression, oh, we all have our little crosses to bear. But this is not something that an affliction that you have to put up with or a nuisance that you have to deal with. Hear this. A cross is something that you choose in the same way that Jesus chose to go to the cross. A cross means a sacrifice. It means being willing to die to self in order to give to another person. In the book, Same Kind of Different as Me, you can read about a man named Denver. He was a homeless man. He had been raised as a sharecropper, and he had been kept in poverty and really kept uneducated by the owner that he was sharecropping for. And eventually he would escape from that by jumping on a freight car one day, but because he had no education and no skill, he ended up homeless, and after a time began to drink because he was so miserable. Well, Denver came to know Christ through the love of a woman named Debbie, who was serving in a soup kitchen. Denver was kind of surly and kept to himself, and she just wouldn't stop loving him. And she kind of pulled her somewhat reluctant husband, Ron, along so that he too could learn to love Denver. But one of the things that Ron observed of Denver over time, after Denver had come to Jesus, is that Denver was very kind to another man. Now this man was a white man. Denver was black. This white man, he was an alcoholic and just a scruffy guy, and he was so difficult to deal with, so contrary, or whatever you want to call it, that his family had finally dumped him. I mean, they'd driven up onto the streets and dumped him and said, "We're done with you." And anytime Denver would go near him, this man would cuss Denver out. He would call him horrible, racist names. You can fill in the blank, the N-word, as we like to say. And yet Ron noticed that Denver would always get a plate of food at the soup kitchen and carry it over to this man. Eventually, this man ended up in a nursing home, and he had some terrible festering sores on him. And Denver would go to see him every day. He would clean him up. He would clean his wounds and spend some time with him. And finally, the man, just steadily cussing and fussing at Denver, he finally said to Denver, "Why do you keep doing this?" And Denver told the man about Jesus, who had died for my sins, said Denver. And he loves you too. And that man became a Christian, and he and Denver became friends. But you see how Denver was willing to sacrifice, even to the point of being humiliated and called horrible names. And the cross, of course, is a symbol of salvation. We can't necessarily grasp all the concept of atonement, and Fuquay says there's a lot of different theories about what atonement really means, but it doesn't matter. What we do know is that Jesus took our sins upon us and set us free from our sins. Fuquay quotes Harry Emerson Fosdick as saying this: "Behind all the explanations of atonement that have arisen and taken form and faded away in the history of Christian thought, this conviction has lain deep. The cross means that it was not easy for God to forgive. It cost. It did cost. It cost God. Among other things, it cost God his only son. It cost God, who loved his son, watching that son suffer. And it cost the very human Jesus, who had to steel himself, fortified by God's strength, to go and take that cross upon himself. It cost. And thus, the cross becomes for us a symbol of God's amazing love, a love that suffers for us, a love that forgives us, a love that sets us free, and a love that teaches us how to love. Okay, well, the cross also reminds us that we are not alone in our suffering. I meant to have it up here with me and I forgot, but for me, for all of us, the cross is a reminder that Jesus suffered and he understands what we suffered. Now Peter, he had to learn that following the Messiah did not mean an end to suffering. He was still going to suffer. Humans are going to suffer. Christians will undergo suffering. The cross is our reminder that God cares. I have a nice little olive cross, and I wish I'd remembered to bring it up in front of the camera, but it's just right. It just fits in the hand. And the pastor gave it to me when I found out I had cancer and was getting ready to go to that first chemotherapy. And I got to tell you, the first time you do chemo, or at least Ellen did, I was terrified of what, because I didn't know what to expect and how sick would I get and all that kind of stuff. But she gave me that cross and said, "I want you to remember that you are loved." And I could grab that cross and hold on to it, and it was a symbol of hope. And it was a reminder that the Messiah suffered for me and knows what I'm experiencing. Peter had expected, a power play from the Messiah. But Jesus did not come to conquer with might of arms. He came to suffer and to die and to enter into our brokenness and suffer alongside us, with us and for us, and to show us there is no place that God refuses to go in the quest to love and redeem us. For all its horrors, the cross has become a symbol of hope because it shows us we're not alone in our suffering and because it reminds us of the hope of the resurrection. Hear what Fuquay says about the cross. Let me see if I can find the correct page here. Page 117, Ellen. There we go. The hope of the cross, he says, comes in meeting the crucified Lord in the crucible of life's trials and finding his presence that sustains us, that helps us believe that good can be erected from the wreckage and gives us faith that we do not walk such lonely paths alone. The first 40 years of the Oberammergau Passion Play were performed in the cemetery where the 84 members of the village had been buried. In the place of their grief, they lifted up the story of the one who came to bear our griefs and sorrows. In the place of death, they told of a Savior who died for us. They praised God for the hope they found in telling the story of the cross. As I said, Fuquay entitled his chapter, The Power of the Cross. And I want to add that, the cross was the real power that Peter was longing for. Peter just didn't understand power when he rebuked Jesus. But Peter would learn, just as we learn. With the cross, Jesus teaches us what real power is. True glory, true life, that it comes in emptying ourselves for others as he did for us. It's a truth that we rebel against, just as Peter did. But we instinctively know that it's true because we know that every time we put aside what we want and do something for someone else or tend to somebody else's need, we feel good because we're doing what we were created to do. In her book called Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World, Rebecca Manley Pierpont recalls an article from the magazine Campus Life. And this article is about a student nurse and her patient. Now, the patient was a woman named Eileen who had I think it was a cerebral aneurysm and seemed to be comatose. As far as doctors knew, she had no conscious control over her body. And they didn't think that she was, they thought she was unconscious and unable to feel pain. Well, the nursing staff had to turn her every hour, and they had to force a tube feed her twice a day. But over time, they had just come to sort of treat her like an object because it's like nobody was there. And when Eileen was given the thankless task of taking care of her, because there wasn't even any family members to come in and say, hey, thanks for taking care of her, an older nursing student told the new nurse, now when it's this bad, you have to detach yourself emotionally from the whole situation because otherwise you'd throw up every time you walked into the room. The student nurse thought about taking that advice, but she felt a call, a Christian duty, as she said, to live out the love of Christ, to treat Eileen with love. And so she did. And so she made a habit of when she came into the room, she would smile, she would speak to Eileen, she'd tell Eileen she was glad to see her, she would sing to her, and she'd even bring her little presents, put up little flowers or bring little presents in for Eileen, always trying to be cheerful when she was around her. Of course, she would never got a response, except for one day. It seems that the student nurse came in and she was really grumpy because it was supposed to have been her day off. And she was feeling all grumpy and everything, and she walked into Eileen's room and she said to herself, no, Lord, I need to be kind to this woman. And so she looked over at Eileen and she greeted her. Good morning, Eileen. I want you to know, she said, I was in a cruddy mood this morning because it's supposed to be my day off. But now that I'm here, I'm glad. I would not have wanted to miss seeing you on Thanksgiving Day, Eileen. Did you know this is Thanksgiving? Well, about that time the phone rang and the student nurse turned away, kind of with her back to Eileen to pick up the phone. And as she turned around, she was startled to see a reaction. She said Eileen was looking at me, crying, big dance circles stained her pillow, and she was shaking all over. Now that was the only emotion that Eileen ever showed, the only time she showed any recognition, but all the nurses, kind of changed their entire attitude towards her. And not much later, Eileen died. And here's what the student nurse said about Eileen. I keep thinking about her, and it occurred to me that I owe her an awful lot. Except for Eileen, I might never have known what it was like to give myself to someone who cannot give back. You know, friends, that decision of this student nurse to treat Eileen with love, this pouring out of herself for one who was so helpless and so unable to respond, that is true power. That is the power of the cross. It is the joy of suffering love. It is the true peace of losing ourselves in serving others. It is the cross that we were meant for. It is the life that Jesus calls us to. It is the life which Jesus knows is the one in which we will find true contentment and peace and joy. My friends, I hope that you will feel the power of the cross in your life this week. Thank you, and God bless you. Bye-bye.